Thank you all again for coming. Thank you for printing these again too. I appreciate that. So this one is a little bit long. We're talking about the 12 links of dependent origination today. We may or may not get through all of it. I may, depending on how much I talk, I may split this in two, like with the Eightfold Path. But then we may get through it all today. Remember, we don't meet next week. I'm on retreat for the weekend, so there'll be a gap. So maybe we'll get through all of this today. I'm also not going to read every word on the page. There's just some extra here for you. I'm just going to hit the highlights, basically, with the 12 links of dependent origination. So normally, when we talk about the 12, or when we talk about dependent origination, this is another way of talking about interdependence, which has to do with impermanence, right? This is something very specific. The 12 links of dependent origination is something very specific. It's an explanation of why we continue in this cycle of ignorance, in the cycle of birth, old age, sickness, death, and rebirth. That's basically what it is. Now, we talk about these as links, like they're links in a chain, but it's not a linear chain. It's a circle. So technically, we can't identify a specific beginning or a specific end. So think of it as a cycle. So you could actually start talking about the 12 links of dependent origination with any of the links. You could begin anywhere in this process because it just takes you in a circle. But traditionally, we start with ignorance. So ignorance means, like I've said here, a lack of light. Avidya, the word avidya, means a lack of light or understanding. And specifically, we're talking about ignorance of the Four Noble Truths. That our existence is pervaded by dissatisfaction and suffering, that this comes from ignorance, but that we can overcome ignorance through following the Eightfold Path, the method that the Buddha taught for overcoming ignorance. So it's ignorance of that. It's also, it's ignorance of the Dharma, basically. Ignorance of the Dharma, the teaching of the Buddha, the teaching of how to identify what is suffering and what is the path out of suffering, and ignorance of how to walk that path out of suffering. That's how we can think of this. And so, like I've said on many occasions, we spend our whole lives then, because of this ignorance, we spend our whole lives trying to suck as much happiness out of whatever we come into contact with. Money, romance, things, We're like crows looking at, shiny things all the time, attracted to them constantly. Because we feel this dissatisfaction. Sometimes we feel like really heavy suffering, but day to day there is this dissatisfaction, which is why we're constantly trying to get those little bits of happiness. So this is how we behave ignorantly. And in order to get those bits of happiness, what do? Sometimes people lie, cheat, steal, they even murder. When we hear about this, people kill their own family members, sometimes for money. This is how messed up we are, or this is how messed up we can be. But even if we're not doing these like really obviously bad things, there's still manipulation, pushing a little bit to get our way. This is what we do. So we're constantly trying to push and pull the world so we can get as much happiness as possible. And in the process, then, we create all kinds of negative karma. This is what we're doing, day in and day out. And so much of it we're not even aware of. It's happening so deeply within our minds, we're not even aware of it. It's really obvious. You take a hammer and you hit somebody over the head, really obvious what you've done. But there's this subtle manipulation, this subtle pushing and pulling throughout the day in order to get what we want. Speaking of hitting someone over the head with a hammer, I did that to my grandfather when I was a little boy. This just popped into my head. We traded hammers. I had a toy wooden hammer, and so he had a real one, so we traded hammers, and he was pretending to hammer a nail, and then I took the real hammer and I knocked him out. Just side story. Anyway, he's 93 years old now, so I think I'm off the hook. He survived. So ignorance is also refers to our belief in a truly existing self. But we talked about this last time with the 5 skandhas. We're just this collection of parts, right? The body is a collection of parts. What we think of as our mind, our personality, our being is just a collection of different parts that are temporary. So this is also the ignorance. I skipped ahead a little bit and I talked about karmic formation. So again, it's because of this need, this ignorance about how to be truly happy, that we have this need to constantly pull happiness out of everything we come into contact with. And so we behave badly. To one degree or another, we behave badly. And we create negative karma. But just the act of grasping, just the act of trying to pull happiness from material things, from money or whatever, that in and of itself is negative karma. Because we're simply reinforcing the attachment. That in and of itself is a powerful cause for being pulled continually through this cycle of birth, old age, sickness, death, and rebirth. It's attachment to having a body itself that is a powerful cause for us to get sucked back into life, physical being. So this is what we're doing. So the next link is consciousness. So when we talked about the 5 skandhas again, you'll see some of the skandhas in here. So when we talked about the 5 skandhas, I explained that consciousness is just this awareness. It's not a thinking mind. I described it as a room filled with light, an empty room filled with light. So it's this potential of awareness upon which the rest of the mind rests, or from which what we think of as the mind, our thoughts and desires and so on, it's from that that these other things arise. So that's consciousness. So obviously we have consciousness. And then we have name and form, number 4 here. So this is the coming together of the 5 skandhas into an individual existence. The form is the body. Okay? And so with this comes the sensory perception. So name and form, working together with our 6 sense organs and the 6 senses, this is what conditions our physical existence. So now we've got a body. So we've got the eyes, we've got the sense of sight, sense of smell, taste, touch, and hearing. Those are the 5 main senses. But remember that there is also in Buddhism the 6th sense, the mind sense. And when I say 6th sense, I don't mean it like we mean in English usually, which is, I'm not talking about like ESP, being able to read minds or see the future or something. We're talking about the mind sense itself. And as I explained, so right now I'm seeing all of you, so I have the eye consciousness, it's active. But if I close my eyes and an image pops into my head, let's say a car, a pizza, or something, that is the mind meeting its object. So that's the 6th sense. So these come together. Name and form with the 6 sense organs come together. And because we have form with the 6 senses, we have contact. So this is just contact between the senses and their objects. Again, I'm seeing you. So the information is reaching my brain. Before I had any ideas about it, it's just the information reaching my brain. That's it. If I smell something, before I identify the smell, just the information reaching my brain, basically, that's how I'm explaining it. I'm using these, sort of modern neurological explanation for this. That is contact. That's all it is. Touching, that's contact. But then here, the seventh one, sensation, is, we call this perception when we talked about the 5 skandhas. This is where we start identifying. I've also seen this link called labeling. Bench. Soup. Person. So this is sensation. Now we think that this happens immediately, but it doesn't actually happen immediately. This happens in sequence. First there is contact, then there is sensation, or this labeling. Usually it happens very quickly, but it actually happens in sequence. And then we have craving. And I've said here that this can also be, we can also think of this as aversion as well. So we come into contact with something and we're like, ooh, that's nice. Or we think, ew, I don't like that. But usually we talk about this in terms of craving, the positive, or the so-called positive side of that. So this is that initial feeling of, oh, that's nice. But then we have the next one, which is clinging or grasping. And this is where we say more. More, 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 more. That's the clinging or grasping. There's this initial feeling of, oh, that's nice, and then it's gimme, gimme, gimme. That's clinging or grasping. And so in this part of the 12 links, we see where this is the part where we're talking about how we are constantly grasping at things, like I said earlier, and trying to pull as much happiness out of them as possible. And this is what motivates us then. We think that these things that we like are giving us real happiness, and so we just keep doing it again and again and again. You know, someone once said, the definition of insanity, the definition of what it means to be crazy, is to keep doing the same thing again and again and thinking you will get a different result. So we're kind of crazy, all of us. Do you see that? Because we see again and again that we keep grasping at things, trying to get happiness. We see again and again that it fails, so we're constantly trying to grasp at something else in order to find happiness. And that fails, so then we do it again. We grasp and grasp and grasp, and it never really works. We're kind of crazy. And so then this leads to becoming. So it's this grasping that we're doing constantly throughout life. We're creating negative karma, which is partly what keeps us, we're acting badly, which is partly what keeps us in the cycle of birth, old age, sickness, death, and rebirth. But then it's, again, as I said earlier, just the act of grasping itself, just the act of grasping at a body, that in of itself, that craving, that wanting for the pleasures of the senses, seeing beautiful things, eating delicious food, having power and wealth and all of that. That is largely what pulls us into becoming, into another life. And so then there's the actual birth, and then eventually we go through this whole cycle again of grasping and so on, and then we come back to old age and death. So this is the process that we go through that keeps us spinning in the cycle of dissatisfaction and suffering. And so this is what we're trying to break out of. Now, once we are pulled into becoming, we can't break this chain, right? We can't break the links of the chain. We're pulled into birth. And once you've got a body, unless you're a vampire and you're immortal, right? We can't avoid old age and death. So where we can break this, realistically, where we can break this cycle is between craving and grasping.